Just over 5 years ago, on March 13th, 2020, I had to send everyone home because of COVID. This was Friday the 13th, so I guess believe what you believe on that point. In those early days, things moved really quickly. I remember earlier in the week having the very first discussions about what was going on and if we were going to do anything, and expecting that we weren't going to do anything. By Wednesday, the parent of one of the friends of my kids canceled a birthday party, and I remember thinking that was pretty weird that they were overreacting. But by Friday, we're sending everyone home and we are working remotely. So here we are 5 years on, and how's the video game looking coming out the other side of COVID? Opening statement is, I'm not entirely sure that the video game industry did come out the other side of COVID. That it is now a new, different, and in some ways worse thing than it was in early 2020. There are some things that have changed that are probably for the better, but I would say that even there, the industry as a whole hasn't quite figured out how to deal with those things. We've seen massive layoffs in 2023 and even more in 2024. And a lot of that, I think, can be traced back to COVID. Sometimes because of very obvious things, sometimes because of less obvious things. Let's talk about what's different and where the industry is going to go from here. Before we get to the layoffs, which have had a huge impact to the industry as a whole, let's talk about work from home. At the beginning of 2020, we sent everybody home. At that time, in most of AAA, remote work was seen as a thing that didn't work broadly. There were the occasional exceptions. You might have a very senior person who you wanted to keep so strongly that you allowed them to work from a different location. But for the most part, the standard line was, this isn't a thing we're supporting. You need to come into an office. And in most cases, that meant into a single office in a single city where everyone gathered to work. You might have multiple offices and then some sort of process of communication between those multiple offices. But that's a very different thing than everyone is now working in their own office, in their own house, and all communication is taking place through a fiber optic cable. So COVID blew the doors off of that and showed the AAA industry that it was possible for people to work remotely. We'd already seen remote studios outside of AAA, but this forced AAA to experiment with this and try it out. The reality is that most AAA studios didn't do a very good job of it. They were forced to try it out very quickly. They had no processes in place. They had no culture around working remotely. And many studios went from the middle of production to the middle of production with everyone scattered to the winds, with no foundation established to do that effectively. But it happened. 5 years in, my sense is that the AAA industry is, for the most part, pretty done with remote work. The more senior people in these larger organizations, people that are, for the most part, my age and older, don't like remote work, don't like the impacts they see it having on communication, don't like the fact that they aren't able to see what's going on more broadly within a studio. And what we're seeing is increasing amounts of pressure to return to an office. Broadly, there are two things we're talking about when we talk about remote work. There's remote work when we underline remote. I'm not even in the same city as the studio I work for. There is no office nearby. A lot of people in 2020, 2021 moved away from the studios that they were working for. And in that case, there isn't really a possibility of that person coming back to the office without requiring them to move back to a city that includes a studio. The second kind is where remote work really just means work from home. I live in the city where my studio is, but I don't go to the office very much. And in that case, it's a lot easier to say, well, we're going to require you to come to the office again. What are we seeing happen to those two kinds of things? In some cases, we are seeing people in different cities being pushed to either move to the city where their studio is or to find another job. There is a pressure being applied to them to move to where their studio is, or at least one of the locations where it has an office. Often this is actually done more through attrition than it is through impacting an individual person. What I mean by that is, in some cases, they aren't willing to fire someone who isn't willing to move, but they are willing to replace that person with a new person that they require to move to the city where the studio is located. But in the case of people who do live in the cities where their studio is located, we are seeing back to office mandates across the board. In most cases, we're still phasing it back in, and maybe we won't get all the way back to 100% of your time is in the office. But what we're seeing is studios are going to, you must be in the office 2 days a week, 3 days a week, 4 days a week, sometimes 5 days a week. Where we've ended up with work from home is pretty inconsistent. Most studios seem to be allowing some degree of work from home, but most of the AAA studios are requiring some degree of in the office for most of their employees as well. There are good ways and bad ways to require some amount of work in the office, and we see studios doing both the good and the bad. If you are going to require your employees to be in your studio 2 days a week, my preference would be to mandate the days that they're going to have to be in the office. Say it's Tuesday and Wednesday, whatever. If you allow a fully flexible schedule of being in the office, you don't really get any benefit from people being in the office. Because I go into the office on Monday and Friday, and you go in the office on Tuesday and Thursday, we still have to do all of our meetings on Zoom. We still don't run into each other. There's still no organic development of culture. So what you've gained is negligible. If you require people to be in the office on the same 2 days, then you can cluster your meetings together when people are able to sit in a room together. You're able to start to redevelop some of that office culture that you lost over the last 5 years. But a lot of studios haven't done that. They've just said, come into the office at least 2 days a week and pick whatever days you want. Come in on a Saturday if you want, when there's nobody in the office. I talked a long time ago about why I was worried that we were going to end up with a hybrid system of work from home, which is actually where we seem to be landing. And my big concern about hybrid was that you end up with this divided system where you end up with inequity in interactions, where people who are together in a space have closer, tighter, better interactions than the people that are remaining remote. If you mandate people be in an office on the same days, you're able to counteract that because you're able to have meetings when everyone is together. If you don't mandate that, you end up with a situation where there are people who are getting different experiences whenever you gather together. And that's not what you really want. I expect that we will continue to see greater pressure to go back to the office, potentially even 100% of the time before anything changes. But I think that long term, what 2020 and 2021 showed us was that while there may be impacts to remote work, while work from home might not be as efficient on the project level as being in the office, though I think there's research yet to be done to show if that's even true, it is possible to do. It is possible to have even very large teams work in a distributed way and figure out how to make a game. Something that I think hasn't been fully considered by people who want to work from home is that you've potentially increased your competition exponentially. If you are an artist in an office, one of your primary competitive advantages to any other artist in the world is that you are physically in the city, in the studio that employs you. If you don't want to come into an office anymore, that advantage goes away. What differentiates you from someone in a much lower cost location like China, you still have competitive advantages, but your physical location stops being one of them because you are effectively on the moon from the day-to-day interaction if you aren't in an office. Will that cause AAA studios to consider distributing their teams to lower cost centers? I don't expect so. I actually expect what we will see is the opposite, is a reinforcement of gathering people together to get what they perceive to be the benefit of co-located people. But consider that if you really want to 100% work from home, that studios, especially studios owned by multinational publicly traded companies, are going to consider that you making a North American salary are a lot more interchangeable with someone making a salary from a lower cost area than you once were. One thing that hasn't happened, at least not yet within AAA, is a blanket resizing. If we are going to live in a hybrid world, that might mean we require less office space, at least if we have different groups going into the office on different days. One of the things you can do in that situation is what's called hoteling, where people come to the office, but they don't have a permanently assigned cubicle. They find an open space, or maybe they have a space that's theirs when they come in on Mondays and Tuesdays, but on Wednesdays, when a different person comes in, they use the same space. One of the things that lets you do is reduce your office footprint. Office space is actually very expensive. So maybe some of the resistance to moving to work from home, moving to distributed work environments, is existing real estate leases. And as those leases come due and are renegotiated, maybe companies will shrink their footprints and be more amenable to people working from home. I don't think so, but that is a possibility. Consider that if you don't do something, then living in a hybrid world is actually quite a bit more expensive, because not only are you paying for all of your existing office space and existing computers, you also have additional infrastructure, additional computers for people to use at home, additional IT work, and you actually have increased your cost of employee. Whereas moving to something where you decrease your footprint potentially means that you can, if not decrease your cost per employee, at least keep it the same as it used to be. Is it possible to solve the problems that Gen X managers like myself see with work from home without pushing everyone back into the office? I absolutely think that it is solvable. And I do think there are companies that are doing this successfully. Usually those companies are pretty small, so it isn't always obvious that those solutions are scalable. But I do believe that if AAA wanted to solve this and wanted to solve it in a way that made people like me comfortable, it is doable. There just hasn't been enough time or enough pressure to cause that to happen yet. One last thing on work from home. If you are an executive, if you are someone who feels the need to get everyone back in the office, I hate to say it, but you have to drink your own poison. If you are working remotely while forcing all of your employees back into the office, that's a pretty tough pill to swallow. And a lot of your arguments start to go out the window. If you feel like it helps with communication, with monitoring, with building culture, why is that not something that you want to be part of? Why do you not want to be part of the monitoring or part of the culture? And we are seeing this. We are seeing studios where leadership is working remotely at the same time as forcing other people back into the office physically. I think that's going to ultimately prove to be a bridge too far for a lot of people. things are tough and people are going to eat a lot of shit right now to keep their jobs, but eventually the labor market's going to shift back the other way, and then I think people are going to react to the resentment that you're building up in them now. And I guess that brings us to the layoffs. 2020 and 2021 saw pretty dramatic hiring for the video game industry. Couple of reasons for this. First of all, velocity at AAA studios, at least in the early days, took a massive kick in the head. The project development started going way slower, and as a result, studios hired to try to cover that to some degree. Additionally, 2020 and 2021 saw the video game industry explode and make tons and tons of money because people were trapped in their houses and video games were a good way to spend the time. And then, of course, once we left our houses again, the business shrunk. People played less video games, people spent less money on video games, and the money slowed down. And you might be thinking, well, these are supposedly smart people running these corporations. Why did they not realize this was going to happen? And they did realize this was going to happen to some degree. They just underestimated pretty dramatically how much it was going to happen. So what they saw was a curve that looked like this, and then COVID happened and it went like, psh, it went straight up and things looked amazing. And what they expected was that that curve was going to continue going up at that original line. They basically just drew a straight line through a couple of years and said, okay, well, we can grow some. We know that we won't be as big as we are today, but we'll be bigger than we were in 2019. That was the expectation. What actually happened was when we reverted, we actually went below what the expectation of that curve would have indicated. Where the C-suites were expecting the industry to be wasn't where it was. People ended up going outside and doing other things more than they had been doing beforehand. You saw this with the growth of industries that were massively affected by COVID. Most of them actually recovered faster and to a greater degree in the early days post-lockdowns than was expected. And time is finite, and that time came from somewhere, and one of the places that came from was video games. But also, it's pretty clear that the big publishers expected that they were going to lay some of these people off. They drew that curve and they said, yeah, we're growing above this curve. We are going to probably lay some people off. I can't imagine that anyone was expecting the layoffs to reach the level that they have over the last 2 years, but I'm sure that somebody in each of the C-suites said something to the effect of, this is an unsustainable number of hires. And the argument that was made was, one, we need to do this for right now to keep the games moving forward. There's money to be made right now. We'll deal with the too many people later. Maybe not quite so bluntly as that, but I suspect it came up and was considered. We've corrected past that initial hiring spree, however. And does that have anything to do with COVID? And I would argue that I think that maybe it does. Because I would say that the live service, the ongoing monetary service of a game reached its most fevered, its most illogical because of COVID. Because again, people were trapped indoors, and in some cases, they didn't have a ton of money. So what happened when they didn't have a ton of money? They still played video games, but they narrowed the video games that they played, and they ended up playing more live services for longer. And those make money, and the AAA publishers saw that and went, wow, this is amazing. And then when they attempted to model a post-COVID world, they tried to consider that people would play less video games. But what they didn't consider was that it wouldn't change in an even way. In 2020, lots of live services were getting eyeballs because people were just playing everything. But when you aren't playing as many games, you might go from playing 2 live services to playing 1. And you end up in a situation where in live services, especially winner wins. And so what we've seen over the last couple of years is a lot more losers, a lot more games that would have probably got enough of an audience in 2020, 2021, not getting an audience at all because people are going outside now. People's time is more restricted because they have other things to do. And as a result, they can't support 2, 3, 4 live services. They're only playing 1, maybe 1.5. And the impact of that is that live services have become, much like they were before COVID, a winner-takes-all kind of game. But we forgot that for 5 years. Right now, there are a lot of people looking for work because layoffs have been truly unprecedented in 2023 and 2024. Some stuff that we haven't seen before. As a result, the people who are offering jobs are not really required to do much in the way of accommodation. If you want to work from home and your employer says, no, we don't want that, you're kind of stuck unless you have a very specific skill set that remains massively in demand. If you are in one of the fields that has seen big layoffs, which is most of the fields, then your ability to negotiate, your ability to fight for yourself is greatly reduced. But I don't think this situation is going to remain this way forever. A lot of the people who got laid off are going to leave the video game industry forever. They will move on to other industries. They will find other jobs. They will be gone for good. The business of video games isn't dying. It's just that AAA got itself off the curve and pretty far off the curve. But over time, the curves should sink back together again. And at that point, there's going to be a demand for more people. And a lot of those people will have left. And then the labor market will get competitive again and people will demand more things. And some things that were never on the table before, things from work from home, or at least a hybrid work environment, are on the table in a way they weren't in the past. So right now, it's pretty dire for getting a job in the video game industry, but it's going to get better. I don't know how quickly, but it will get better eventually. The other thing is that we're starting to see a shift of the games that publishers are supporting, as they're finally realizing that every game can't be a live service forever game that is supporting itself on microtransactions. They are remembering that single player games exist, and they are even getting signals from games that they are developing themselves that single player games can be successful. But the reality is that the skill sets required to make a live service game and the skill sets required to make a single player game aren't the same. And we're starting to see studios that have either pivoted to single player games or at least increased the effort they're spending on their single player development are finding themselves short on skill sets that they kind of forgot that they needed over the last 5 years. And we are going to see a demand increase for people that know how to build narrative, know how to do storytelling, because a lot of that has been deprioritized over the last little while. So how did COVID affect the video game industry? I would argue it kind of broke it, but the parts are still rolling along, trying to reform themselves into something. And I think over the next 2 years, the video game industry will probably figure itself out again, and we will get to some kind of new normal. But we're 5 years in, and we aren't there yet. So that might be wishful thinking. 5 years is a long time, longer than the average career that most people have in the video game industry. So a lot of people have now grown up inside of a video game industry that has been wobbling and stumbling in this post-COVID world. I obviously started well before COVID, and I left Bioware basically a year in. So my view is a little skewed, but I think everyone's view is a little skewed. If you got hired in 2020, you've only ever lived in this world. So your willingness to return to a pre-COVID world is a lot different because you never experienced that at all. If you are someone who's been in the industry longer, you remember the before times, and therefore you can kind of pattern match to what it might be going back to that. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have a Patreon if you would like to support the channel in that way. Members and Patreons get access to our Discord, so if you want to interact with our community in a deeper way, that's a great way to do it. If you're in the video game industry, tell me what you're seeing at the studio you work for. What's changing? What's staying the same? Where do you expect that you're going to end up? Do you expect it's going to be 5 days a week back in the office at some point? Do you think that it's going to be distributed forever? What other impacts have you seen? What do you wish would come back from before COVID that hasn't yet come back? And what are you glad is dead and likely to stay dead? Things are rough out there, but I do think we're going to start to see the other side of this over the next couple of years. A couple of years is a pretty long time when you are trying to make sure that you're feeding yourself. But I think that's what it's going to take. I think we're not completely done just yet. I will see you again soon. Thank you.